On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
To be honest, I would simplify it. Ashkenazi Jewish food is loaded with fat and carbs and stuff that's not good for you, and meat. And meat was out of fashion for a really long time. Whereas Mediterranean, Moroccan Jewish, whatever, very bright, colorful, produce, healthy, blue zone. Whatever the opposite of a blue zone diet is what Ashkenazi food is.
Hi, I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and you're listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News, where I look at Jews' complicated place in today's cultural and political landscape. Caught between anti-Semites and over-enthusiastic philo-Semites, how do we make sense of our situation? So the summer issue of Scribe Quarterly, the print magazine from the CJN, is about Jews and food, and I encourage you to read it, but there is always more to say on the matter. And I've been mulling a couple items in that realm, both Michael Kaminer's recent article for the CJN's website about trendy new Jewish restaurants in Toronto, and also a June essay by Navneet Lang, a Toronto Star opinion editor that appeared on his personal website called The Trouble with David Schwartz. It's about the cultural significance, political significance of a white chef getting positive press for his Chinese restaurants, and it barely mentions Schwartz's Jewishness. So I was kind of sitting with this. I was trying to square two things in my mind that both seem true, that we're living in a time where the fact that a chef or restaurateur is Jewish is relevant in how you talk about sort of the politics of its reception, but also that there is this wider world in which most North American Jews do register as white, and everybody, things are relative, everybody perceives things differently. And it seemed like the kind of Jews stuck in the middle story that's very much my beat. And I was thinking about this in this kind of calm way, and I was going to unpack it and think about it when I had time, when I got around to it. And then something happened, which is that on July 1st, Canada Day, someone shot a gun into Mimi Chinese, one of Schwartz's restaurants. Later that week, that same building was shot into again. It's not yet known why. I don't know why. Maybe somebody knows why. Maybe the shooter knows why. Maybe not even. I don't know. Or shooters. I don't know. But suddenly this seemed less like a sort of me and my evergreen musing story and more like something urgent to think about, cover, not in the sense of investigative journalism of forensic details of bullets, but culture, restaurants, Jews, things of that nature. And really just because of the places my own mind goes when I hear about a shooting at a Jewish-owned restaurant, certainly one not far from where I live. I don't know what to make of a lot of this or even how to have these conversations in these times. So I am thrilled that Michael Kaminer, the author of the piece for us about Toronto's Jewish food revival, has agreed to come on the show for this episode. Michael is a prolific journalist, many of whose New York Times articles I had already read before meeting him, happenstance in Toronto, including $1 million homes in Finland, for which he did not go to Finland, but he can tell you anything you want to know about $1 million homes in Finland. Michael is based in Toronto and New York and is from Montreal. So there's your Canadian Jewish angle, if you will. Michael, welcome to the Jewish Angle.
Thank you.
So at the beginning of your article, which is fantastic, and I learned a lot from it and want to eat in all these places, you list a bunch of different sort of Ashkenazi Jewish foods that are being revived in Toronto at the moment. Cholent or cholent, I don't know, karnatzel, kasha, challah, blintzes. It's a quote. 4 of these I recognized, and 3 I have eaten, but I don't know one of them. What is karnatzel?
Oh, karnatzel. If you grew up in Montreal, you would know karnatzel. It's a very slim, it's like a Slim Jim, basically, except the Ashkenazi Jewish version. And to be honest with you, I have no idea what exactly goes into a karnatzel, but I grew up eating them as a kid. And if you walked into Schwartz's or one of the famous delis in Montreal, you'd always see a karnatzel hanging from the ceiling. But just picture a Slim Jim, just this
Okay.
very slim tube of meat. And again, God knows what's in it. I'm going to figure pork is not, but it is
Yeah.
definitely meat.
Well, how the sausage gets made is always
We don't want to know. Yeah. But
right.
except at Lenny's, you probably do want to know because I'm jumping ahead, but David Schwartz makes those in house, which is very unusual, very labor intensive, and very time consuming.
That is interesting. Yeah, that was going to be, I was going to ask who is making karnatzel. So that's David Schwartz is the one making
That's right.
karnatzel. I see. I see. But presumably not at Nimi Chinese.
Not yet.
Although anything could...
Fusion is happening, so
I was
who
gonna say,
knows?
it could...
Keep an eye
Right.
on the menu.
Yeah. So what is your own relationship to Canadian Jewish food?
Well, having grown up in Montreal, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. My parents are immigrants. So I grew up, traditional Jewish Ashkenazi food was not a novelty for me. It was what we ate every day, what my grandmothers cooked, what my mother cooks still. And even the restaurants in Montreal where we went, it wasn't a shtick. That was what we ordered when we went out to some Montreal restaurants that would serve it. Those restaurants don't exist anymore. This is the old school, very first wave when I was a kid. Places like the Brown Derby in Montreal that some of your listeners might recognize, where the menu was all very straight up Ashkenazi Jewish food. So that's my relationship to it. I mean, a very firsthand experience when I was growing up, where it was really just, it was our menu. I mean, other things, of course, like everybody else, we go out for Chinese food and go to steakhouses and whatnot. But the Ashkenazi food was part of our routine.
It's interesting because I'm trying to remember how big a role that type of food played in my own childhood. So my maternal grandmother was from Montreal. My parents both grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in Manhattan. And I'm just trying to think, like, this definitely, like, I knew, like, kasha varnishkas. I knew what this was, and I had eaten it in my life. But how often would I actually eat this type of food? I would say not very often. It was something that I knew. It definitely, like, there are ingredients that I still have in my house. Like, I will have matzah in the house year round to make matzah bread, whatever. But, like, this, it was such a small sort of percentage of what I would eat. And it was much more just sort of whatever was around type food, which is interesting because these chefs that you're writing about, so like I was born in 1983. I would assume they are a bunch of them quite a bit younger. I know David Schwartz is quite a bit younger. And I just wonder like how much this is like, it has to be kind of sought out, or whether in the Canadian, especially Montreal experience, this would have been like a bigger part of day-to-day life.
Well, I think you just hit on it. That's one of the biggest differences I've noticed living, having grown up in Montreal and now I've lived in the States for quite a while, is you know that old adage about Canada being the U.S. is a melting pot, Canada is a mosaic. I mean, it's a cliche, but it's really reflected in how Jewish food kind of plays out in people's lives here versus there. So in Brooklyn, for example, or in New York, things like matzo ball soup are on every diner menu everywhere, and I guess you can experience it, wherever you want, and it's almost become a generic thing. But growing up where I grew up, and a lot of the people I know who grew up with the same kind of background, just had, again, a very firsthand relationship to a lot of these kinds of foods, where they had not necessarily mainstreamed. I think there was almost an imperative, aside from the fact that it was what we knew and what we loved. Underneath that, I think there might have been an imperative to try to keep it alive by cooking it. If I had to psychoanalyze some of the where some of those food habits were coming from. So I think there is, you nailed it, that I think there's a big difference in the approach to this, at least in some Canadian cities versus the American experience around this food.
No, that is interesting. So I was thinking that a lot of the Jewish nostalgia cuisine I remember from New York of the 2010s was Montreal inspired. So I'm thinking like of Mile End or Black Seed Bagels, and maybe that's just two examples, but that I remember them seeming, it seems to loom large, like the sort of Montreal Jewish, or maybe Seth Rogen can be the third. Um, and it's exciting to see this happening in Canada as well. But something I'm wondering, is this sort of happening later? Is this like this deli nostalgia? I wrote about hipster Judaism and deli core like a couple months ago. Is this happening sort of later in Canada?
Um,
Like in the
Maybe. I
revival
think it's
sense?
happened in waves. I mean, I did a
Hmm.
story for the Washington Post 10 years ago
That is why I ask.
about
Yes.
a Jewish nouveau deli revival that was happening more than a decade ago. I think there's probably a million different factors. I mean, first of all, the fact that Mile End and Black Seed came to New York was again because the Jewish food culture in Montreal is still pretty strong, and because some of those people like Noah Bernamoff and uh, he was the proprietor of Mile End and Black Seed. I think we have similar backgrounds, right? And then I also think honestly, every time there's a crisis or things completely go bananas in the world, people do tend to reach for nostalgic anything. And I think that might be another catalyst for why uh, some of these nostalgic Jewish foods get revived. And then, as David Schwartz pointed out in the piece that I did for CJN, probably like every other culture, Jewish chefs go out into the world and they go work at Momofuku or they go study at the Cordon Bleu or whatever and want to move as far as possible from what they grew up with. And then after finding success or, cooking dumpling, or whatever exotic fusion food they've cooked, they start getting a little bit of a pang for their own type of food and want to reclaim their identities. So it so happened with David, with Shauna in the piece, with Zach Kolomeyer, who's in the piece. Coincidentally, I think they all had this sort of moment around the same time and decided to explore their Jewish food roots in very, very different ways.
So I wanted to ask about that because I had actually specifically highlighted that quote from David Schwartz that's in your piece. Chefs at first don't want to cook the food of their heritage, but come back to it eventually. End quote. I'm wondering if this is more true of Jewish chefs and maybe more Canadian Jewish ones, maybe more Ashkenazi Jewish ones. I don't know, but whether there is a specific like sort of cringe that happens about like, I'm not going to make like that kind of old school food. And the reason I ask is partly because of the reactions I sometimes get when I tell people I work at the Canadian Jewish News. Sometimes people are like, oh, that's nice. And other times people are like, oh, that's like associated with like my bubbe and this kind of like cringing where they kind of cringe in a way. You know what I'm
Right.
talking about? Is
I
this
do. Well,
okay?
I'm going to go back to my favorite quote from Annie Hall, which is Woody Allen saying, I'd never want to belong to any club that would have someone like me as a member. So I think there's some of that feeling for some of these chefs. And then eventually they get over it. And like anyone else, sort of reclaiming their culture,
But
you
isn't like
start.
anyone else. That's kind of what I want to drill down on. Is like, is this more pronounced among Jews or Canadian Jews or Ashkenazi Jews than, or is this just like a universal human thing? Like, are there,
Um,
like, I don't think there are French chefs doing this.
that's an excellent question. And I was just thinking, well, I don't know any Italian chefs who said, I'm moving as far away from my Italian culture because of whatever. Of course, the history and the whole cultural aspect is a little more fraught with us.
Hmm.
And also, I don't think Jewish food was considered cool for the longest time. And now I think
Hmm.
there's a cool factor coming in. So if you were a chef trying to make your name in the world, whether it's in Canada or elsewhere, maybe it was not necessarily the way to establish your cred by cooking kreplach, as your in your first restaurant.
But they're quite nice.
Whereas now it's a completely different ballgame. And again, the reason I called out those 5 dishes at the top of the CJN story was to say exactly that. Guess what? This is bubby food, but guess what? It is now the hippest 5 things on the menu with these restaurants.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, not long ago, not far away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.
When I was growing up, there was a lot of this kind of, it wasn't Jewish self-hatred, but it was specifically Ashkenazi culinary self-hatred. And self-hatred is too strong. I'm kind of using this tongue-in-cheek, but like where a lot of the time Jews of my own background would be like, our food is gross, but we like Jewish food. We like Mizrahi food. We like Sephardic food. We like Israeli food. That's the food that has flavor. That's the food that has the fresh produce in it. That's the good food. And maybe like, are we seeing kind of a reversal of that? Or is that not such a thing? Or another possibility? Okay, I'm not going to leave it at one thing. Is it that there's maybe like a sort of political bifurcation happening where you get one sort of political ideological team that's like patronize your local Israeli-owned falafel stand, and the other is like pro-diaspora? Or am I oversimplifying? Because I suspect I'm oversimplifying, and I'll get to why. But
Well, we have to sort of untangle a couple of things here. One is that, I think I can't remember if I had this line in the piece, but I was careful not to lump in Israeli Mediterranean food or kosher food with the stuff that I was writing about.
Oh, that's clear. That's very clear that
different.
that's clear that these are different. Yes.
So that's one thing. The second thing is where you grew up, I'm going to assume, versus where I grew up, everybody was an immigrant where I grew up. When I moved to the States and I heard an old person talk with an accent, I was shocked. That was my environment growing up. So nobody thought that food was gross because, number one, they loved it. It was the food from back home. And I wouldn't say they were defiant about cooking it, but there was never a thought that it was anything other than like beloved food that we actually wanted to eat as much as possible. So it didn't have that. It wasn't loaded the way maybe second or third or fourth generation Jews would want to move away from it. The way I think it's probably natural for any immigrant group to try to maybe move away from some of the...
Sure, but with the specificity, I think, being the Zionist angle. So it wasn't just about like... So some of it was Moroccan Jewish food sounds better than Polish Jewish food to some people. I'm not going to state where I stand on this, but no, I don't know. It depends. It depends which food. But some of it was also about like, there's a Zionist element to it too, right?
Yeah, honestly, I'm not sure I would go there. To be honest, I would simplify it to the fact that Ashkenazi Jewish food is loaded with fat and carbs and stuff that's not good for you, and meat. And meat was out of fashion for a really long time. Whereas Mediterranean, Moroccan Jewish, whatever.
The Mediterranean diet.
Very bright, colorful, produce, healthy, blue zone. Whatever the opposite of a blue zone diet is what Ashkenazi food is. And actually, these new generation chefs, the ones in the CJN story, are pretty defiant about that, about using meat, about using schmaltz, about using, I'm trying to remember some of the other ingredients that Shauna mentioned that she's using at Maven. So rather than, like, I understand the thinking about putting a political overlay on it. To be honest, I think it may be as simplistic as the perception of healthfulness versus something like that.
Oh, this is so interesting. And this is why I'm glad that I don't just do a column, but that I also do a podcast and talk to other people and get outside of my somewhat limited brain, because I think there is something to this, and that this is putting everything in a totally different context for me, because I'm now thinking like there have been these changes in how health is talked about and which foods are considered healthy. And now we have this whole, this is the right-wing thing in the US of the beef tallow, but there has been this kind of health promoting almost reclamation of, I dare say, the pastrami sandwich. And to do another Woody Allen reference, from Sleeper, didn't they know about like deep fat? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Okay. In case our listener, I'm sure whoever's listening to this does know what I'm talking about. But Sleeper, Woody Allen's sort of satirical sci-fi movie where it's set in a future where science knows that you should actually be eating very fattening foods. And I feel like we're kind of living in that future now. That's why I think about that line so much, but that maybe there is more of like a pastrami sandwich. Well, it's not a seed oil.
Right. There's that. And don't forget, I feel like we're still, even though it's a little bit in the rear view, we're still in a post-COVID moment where it's about revenge eating and everything you have to sacrifice during that time. Everybody's going completely bananas, eating things that are, quote unquote, bad for them. So I think there's a certain aspect of pleasure seeking in indulging in this food without worrying about it or feeling guilty about it that is enabling these chefs to do what they do. And there's a kind of in the bigger restaurant world right now, there is a kind of maximalism going on, like small plates, spare plates, minimalist plates, nouveau anything where it's really spare. That is really not what's happening. And I can tell you in New York, and at least what I can see in Toronto, is that it's all about bigger plates, more fried, more loaded with everything, with sauce, with butter, you name it. The more you can dump on. It's funny, not to get too tangential, there's a similar trend going on right now in home decor, where it's all about maximalism. It's all about putting as many patterns and textures in a room as you possibly can. So to go back to your point, yes, it's about the beef tallow crazy right-wing moment, but I also think there's still some of this post-COVID, I'm going to get as much pleasure as possible when I'm eating and not worry about it because I'm still making up for those years.
Well, I'm excited for that trend in home decor. That sounds
it's happening.
That sounds
I
great.
see some patterns behind you, so that's a good start.
This is nothing. This is nothing.
Okay.
But so you mentioned Dreyfus, the restaurant Dreyfus, and as it happens, my first ever piece for the CJN was an interview with its chef, with Zachary Colomer. And it was this was in January 2020. This appeared, was sort of a pre-COVID. I think the interview certainly was pre-COVID. And it was about the restaurant's name. And because to my knowledge, it's the only restaurant anywhere whose name is actually a reference to a famous anti-Semitic historical event. Do you know of any other?
No, I'll try to think of one, but off the top of my head, no, he might be the first.
Yeah, I mean, all I could think of is Vichy sunscreen and face products, but that's not the same thing at all. But basically, what was interesting, though, I was noticing in your piece that when you ask him about like sort of what response he's gotten or anticipated, and he's saying it's not a religiously Jewish restaurant. So it's been like he keeps the religion stuff separate or something. But I'm thinking like the Dreyfus Affair wasn't really about religion either. I thought that was just an interesting answer because the Dreyfus Affair was a Jewish, for listeners who may not know, French Jewish army officer wrongly convicted of treason in the late 19th century. Theodor Herzl famously covered this. This may or may not have inspired him to, found modern political Zionism. Anyway, I thought that was an interesting response that he said about the stuff about religion. But I wanted to talk, though, specifically about religion and where this fits in, because I'm wondering about the clientele of these restaurants in Toronto, because like you say, they're not kosher restaurants and they're located outside the sort of Jewish restaurant zone, which, as I understand it from the number 7 bus, is on Bathurst. So what I'm wondering is how aware do you think, I'm not even going to ask how many of the diners are Jewish, because I would assume probably it couldn't be that many just demographically, but how aware do you think they are that these even are Jewish restaurants?
I asked a similar question of the chefs. What I said was, how many of your customers tell you they are familiar with this food and love it? And how many tell you they are discovering this food for the first time, as if they were going to eat like Burmese food or something they've never eaten? They said it's pretty equally divided. But there are even some, so in terms of how many Jewish customers there are, they really couldn't say because they don't ask them when they walk through the door.
That's
They did
probably
tell
for the
me
best.
they told me maybe they get a discount. They told me two things. One is that people will say, "Oh my God, my bubbe used to make," like that kind of response to food. And there is a frequent response where a customer will say, "What is this? I had never tasted this." Cholant or however, because they're not
Mhm.
going to pronounce it properly. So most of the chefs said it is equal parts sort of a reconnection for some people and a discovery for some people. But I imagine that's not necessarily divided between Jewish and non-Jewish lines, because
I would have
for
said
secularized
cholent.
Jews, yeah, some of them may never have. If you're in a third or fourth generation household, there's a good chance you've never had or even heard of some of this stuff.
Yeah, like those karnatzels that I don't know about.
There you go.
So I was wondering about just like the openness question, because there's definitely a thing where Israeli restaurants call themselves Mediterranean. There's definitely a thing where other like also, I mean, there's near me a Palestinian restaurant calling itself Mediterranean too, that like has a Palestinian other branch, like not just the cuisine, but whatever. So this definitely exists, but how open are these restaurants in their PR materials, whatever, signage, anything, menus? Like, how overt is the Jewishness, or is it if you know, you know?
Um, Two-part answer. I'd say it's pretty overt in the messaging around the restaurants, and in some of the explanations on the menus, I think, of where some of this food came from. But none of the restaurants have signage outside that says Linny's, a Jewish restaurant. And David Schwartz had a great quote, which was, if you said you were a Christian restaurant, I'd feel a little weird walking through the door. So I don't think they feel the need to put it on the outside of the restaurant. And I have to say, in interviews I've seen in other media with some of these chefs, they're 100% out there about the fact that it's Jewish inspired. They're Jewish, Jew, 100%. So, but not necessarily, on the outside of the restaurant, which is probably appropriate.
I think it could go either way. I mean, I think Jewish is different from Christian in the specificity and what it refers to. But at the same time, I feel like having lived through the 2010s, I know that if a place called itself a Jewish restaurant, it would get potentially pushback, not just from, and I will get to this next, because I cannot not get to this, the people who wish Jews ill, but it would also potentially get the response of, why are you saying this is Jewish food? It's not just that Ashkenazi food is Jewish food. And even if you say that's true, this is Jewish food, and so is other stuff, you would get that whole sort of pushback also. So it may just be easier to be the thing and not announce it in that way.
Maybe, but there also another aspect of this. They're all very clear about specific inspirations for this food. So it's not just here's kasha. It's an Ashkenazi Jewish food. It's here's my grandmother's recipe. She used X, Y, and Z. I am chefing it up by putting this stuff in it. Or at N.L. Ginsberg, Zach's Kohlmeyer's new restaurant. Like, this is the thing we saw traveling through this part of Rome where Jews did this, that with these ingredients. So they're very clear about the inspiration for where some of this food came from. So again, do they need to define it the way you're describing it? I'm not really sure,
I'm not
because
saying
they're
they
doing
need
it in
to. I'm
their own
just
way.
saying, yeah, no, I think that makes sense. It was not me saying that they should do otherwise. I promise.
But
Yeah.
agreed that the danger of none of them wanted to talk about this, and I don't blame them, because they were very clear that the sort of Jewish food culture being very different from Judaism. I mean, might sound basic to us, but I think some people may not think about it that way. But they were very clear about wanting to be perceived that way, that their restaurants are about celebrating Jewish food culture, and not about Judaism. And maybe that is another reason why putting the word Jewish on the tin is not necessarily what they wanted to
Right.
do.
I mean, then there's a further aspect of, you would have people who keep kosher saying, how dare you call this a Jewish restaurant if, observant Jews can't eat at it.
100%.
So I don't want to only talk about the depressing stuff, but I'm going to talk about the depressing stuff because we have just a little time left and I have to.
That's what we do.
And then I will drown my sorrows in a smoked meat sandwich somewhere. But as somewhat depressing research for this podcast and also for a column I'm writing about these topics, I did some non-comprehensive research on how many Jewish restaurants in Canada and elsewhere in the diaspora have been either protested, vandalized, attacked, boycotted, or otherwise hassled since October 7th, 2023. And it is a lot. And what surprised me the most is how many are ones that have no particular connection to Israel. So it's not that there's no BDS angle that I can see, or if there is, it's extremely tangential, like who the restaurant owner is suspected of supporting politically. So like I'm thinking specifically of like the Second Avenue Deli in New York City, sure. Or there was a Bay Area bagel shop, or like a bagel shop in Toronto. Also, some chain was boycotted or whatever, things like that. So it's not that deli food or Ashkenazi home cooking are in the clear. And there was even a Guardian restaurant review last year that I wrote about at the time by Jay Rayner, who's a critic who's Jewish himself, where he's sort of hand-wringing about whether it's unseemly, given the war in Gaza, to review a New York-style deli in London. And he fortunately decides he's allowed to do that. And I'm glad That's he decides
nice
that.
Of him.
But the hand-wringing itself kind of drove me nuts, which is why I wrote about it. But I'm wondering, though, whether the reason we're seeing this revival does come in some sense from this idea that Jewish food that harkens back to a time before the modern state of Israel even existed has a certain nostalgic appeal now. Whether any of that, aside from the all the trends you talk about, the maximalism, the cholesterolism, or whatever it is, like there is something that feels a little less like, if you're going to do Jewish food now, like I'm thinking of a restaurant like Cafe Landwehr, which has the sort of deli type food, but also has these Israeli influences. But whether there's something about like, this is Montreal, this, you know what I mean? Like whether there's some aspect of it that explains why that feels right in this moment. Not that, and I say this not with any knowledge of where any of these chefs stand on politics, but almost this avoidance of politics.
I honestly think that might be reading too much into it.
It would not be my first time doing so.
I can't imagine that's, and I can't speak for the chefs, I just can't imagine that that's been part of their thought process in putting this together. I think reconnecting with past before Israel, whatever, 100%. There's a reason why people line up around the block to go into Katz's every single day when I walk by there when I'm in New York. And
is it good? I've never actually been.
It is what it is, but
okay.
It's my point is that it's an experience, and people feel like they're reconnecting with a past, a New York past, possibly a Jewish past that so doesn't exist anymore. But they will line up to have that hour of reconnection with a mythical, whatever they think it is. So I think that's a strong part of it. Mm-hmm. If there is a dotted line to draw between what you're talking about and some of these experiences, I think at a time when everything is upside down, people feel threatened, they are going to want to gravitate more towards things that are comforting. So definitely from that angle, I could see how you could have that conversation. But in terms of the chef somehow putting that in the formula, based on politics, I have a little more trouble.
I don't know. I guess I'm not trying to assign agency to any party. It's more just why would what's happening sort of more broadly in the culture? Why, because now it feels like when I see something about a restaurant being Israeli and that's being played up, it feels, I see this in the context of pro-Israel philo-Semitic politician patronizes restaurant to show support for, that's the context I see that in. And maybe, I don't know. But I also wanted to ask, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I was about to say that at the same time all this is happening, and even though this is a slightly different topic, there is a chef who's opening a chain of Israeli restaurants that started in Israel, went to New York, and now is in Toronto. The name escapes me, of course. But they're opening more and more and more restaurants, like the giant fried cauliflower is their signature.
It's that one that was just attacked in Melbourne, actually.
Potentially. Miznan.
Yeah.
But they're people are eating there, they're growing. And again, we need to keep in mind that the moment that we're in, certainly there are organized protests and boycotts, but there's also a lot of individual people acting out, disconnected necessarily from any political movement, and throwing things at a restaurant, firing a gun. So if that reflects, then they're not necessarily part of a bigger organized movement against these restaurants. You have a lot more individual actors now doing what they want to do and acting out against their perceived enemies. And if the perceived enemy happens to be a restaurant with a Jewish owner or a chef, that's what they're going to do. They're going to throw paint. It could be a 15-year-old who thinks they're doing something righteous. So, I feel like these situations are so gray right now. It's challenging to connect straight lines between some of the political stuff and some of what these chefs are doing.
Sure. No, I think that makes sense. And I wanted to ask all about the cultural appropriation discourse, but I think our time may have run out, so I may just have to write about it and drone on for the people who read that. But what are you working on now, and where can we find you?
Well, I have to pitch my next CJN story. Right now, I'm more New York Times real estate stories. I'm actually wrapping up Whistler, BC as we speak, where
Ooh,
$3 million
exciting.
buys you a house in really, really bad shape. And
I will find another use of my $3 million.
yeah, just
Mm-hmm.
FYI. And I read about real estate for Mansion Global, which is part of Dow Jones and a bunch of other places. So travel for afar occasionally, and here and there. So tell your friends.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Michael Kaminer, for coming on The Jewish Angle. This has been fantastic.
Thank you. This was fun.
Thank you for listening to The Jewish Angle, a podcast from the Canadian Jewish News. This has been Phoebe Maltz Bovy, opinion editor of the CJN and a contributing editor of Scribe Quarterly, the CJN's print magazine. The show is produced and edited by Michael Fraiman. Our music is by Frank Fraiman. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to The Jewish Angle wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
On the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz comes an unprecedented exhibition about one of history's darkest moments. Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, features more than 500 original objects, first-hand accounts, and survivor testimonies that tell the powerful story of the Auschwitz concentration camp, its history and legacy, and the underlying conditions that allowed the Holocaust to happen. On now exclusively at ROM. Tickets at rom.ca.